Good afternoon and welcome to the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast Regional Community of Practice Professional Training event, where we focus on the community's role in supporting our veterans through transitions. This training is presented by Serving Together, a program of EveryMind as part of the Regional Community of Practice efforts for the AmericaServes Mid-Atlantic region. This project was supported under a grant awarded by the Walmart Foundation to Syracuse University. This event will be recorded and shared via YouTube link once the event has ended. We will share presenter materials following the event. Please utilize the chat to communicate with the other participants as well as panelists. And if you have any questions, we encourage you to utilize the Q&A feature. This regional community of practice is available for 2 community continuing education credits, and all certificates will be emailed to those who have registered and requested credits. As many of you may be familiar, EveryMind is a nonprofit organization out of Montgomery County whose mission is to strengthen our communities and empower individuals to reach optimal mental wellness. We provide a variety of direct services to the entire lifespan, including 24/7 hotline, homeless outreach, school-based mental health services, and much more. We also strive to reduce the stigma surrounding mental illness and increase the importance of mental wellness for everyone. For more information, please visit our website at every-mind.org. For more information on our programs about serving together, we are focused on providing resources and assistance for military veterans and their families in the National Capital and Central Maryland regions. And among our objectives, we strive to provide education to the community to help better support service members, veterans, and their families and caregivers. Serving Together in EveryMind, we're selected to serve as the Regional Community of Practice Champion to support the work in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast regions AmericaServes coordination centers, with the goal to provide educational training opportunities to our network users from Serving Together in the National Capital and Central Maryland community, to Mission United in South Hampton Roads, to PA Serves in Greater Pittsburgh, to Rhode Island Serves in Rhode Island, and New York City's Vet Connect, New York City. We conduct these trainings based on feedback we have received from you, but it's crucial that we receive your feedback to provide the most requested topics you need. We will have a survey at the end of today's event, so we encourage you to provide feedback so we know how the event went today, but also what future information you'd like to receive. It is my honor and privilege to introduce you to our keynote for this afternoon, Meaghan. Meaghan is a West Point graduate, Afghanistan veteran, and former Army captain, a clinical psychology pre-doctoral fellow at Columbia University Teachers College. Her research and work evolves around better understanding the critical role of transition stress in the lives of military veterans and the heterogeneity of the veteran experience. Meaghan serves as a presidential appointee to the United States Military Academy, West Point Board of Visitors, and is a George W. Bush Veteran Leader Scholar, Tillman Military Scholar, and a Noble Argus and National Military Family Association Scholarship recipient. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please utilize the Q&A feature. We will monitor the Q&A to help facilitate questions for our speakers and panelists. And you can feel free to use the chat to communicate with participants, our keynote and panelists as needed. But again, any questions, please enter through the Q&A button. I will turn it over to Meaghan to start the event. And Meaghan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Christy, thank you so much. And I will go ahead and start sharing my screen as well. Let's see if we can do this. All right. Is everybody able to see that? Hopefully so, because we are going to go ahead and get started. So thank you for that lovely introduction, Christy. It is such a pleasure and honor to be here. I really can't tell you how much how important it is that we're speaking to people that are boots on the ground and doing the necessary work to help our nation's veterans. I wish I could see all of your faces, but we're going to do the best with what we've got. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump right in. Today, I will be talking about the shared cost, so the community's role in better understanding veteran transition stress. So as always, there's a requisite disclaimer. These views and opinions expressed are my own, and they don't reflect any organization or person I might be affiliated with or represent. These are the objectives for today. These are very, very broad, and I understand that, and it's a short time and a lot to cover. And I realized as I was putting all of this together that there are really entirely two separate presentations. One is a talk about the potential origins of transition stress from a psychological perspective and current directions, researching and better understanding that phenomenon. And then there's the focus on mitigating efforts. So this is kind of a bit of a hybrid between the two, kind of trying to talk a little bit about origins, prevalence rates, things like that, while also talking about the role of community partners in increasing well-being and helping to close that deadly gap. And when I talk about the deadly gap, which I may reference throughout the duration of this presentation, what I'm really talking about is that kind of first year post-transition. And I want to acknowledge up front, this is by no means a comprehensive kind of overview of everything related to transition stress, but we'll cover as much as possible and hopefully have time for questions. Janae sent me some questions over that were included on the registration form. So hopefully I'll be able to answer some of those throughout the presentation. And if not, I'm more than happy to try to take all of them at the end as well, or just go down the list and try to answer where I can. So as we begin, this is just a kind of a quick question, some food for thought as we spend some time together today. So we know who's responsible to train our troops. We know who has decision-making authority to send them to war and bring them home, but who has the responsibility to help transition service members back into civilian life? So I just want us to think about that for a moment. Who bears that responsibility? Is it an organization, an institution? Is it the government, or is it individuals? And particularly thinking about that or framing that around this idea of the post-draft America. So as we are in an age of an all-volunteer force, what does that mean for bearing the responsibility of transitioning our service members? And before we can really get into understanding transition stress, I think it's important that we kind of get some quick background on the current state of veteran affairs. So be prepared for some word-heavy slides, which I know will make every marketing professional cringe. So please forgive the eyesore and kind of the inundation of information. There's just so much that I want to put out and make sure that I am equipping you guys with that information, that data to help inform your programming or just your broad knowledge of what it's like for veterans currently. So as you can see, this is obviously a bit of an outdated statistic, but more than 1.7 million of the 2.6 million soldiers deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan have transitioned back to civilian life. I'm going to use soldier again. That's just kind of easier than using soldier, sailor, airman, marine. Obviously, the burden of deployments has been shared across different branches of service, but just again, for the purpose of streamlining, I will be referring them to soldiers. And then there's another 1 million expected to do so over the next 5 years. That was back in 2015. So obviously it's been 5 years since that occurred. So the majority of those who have deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan have transitioned back to civilian life. Those numbers aren't quite clear yet, but as the winding down is happening with kind of the full withdrawal anticipated on 9/11 of this year, the expectation is that there will be even smaller numbers that deploy or that are staying on active duty, and the bulk of obviously are going to be transitioning back to civilian life. And with that in mind, it's going to be many years before the full psychological impact of these recent military campaigns are known. We just don't know what we don't know quite yet. And there's a variety of reasons. One, because this is the first time we've been at war for this long, these very protracted military engagements, combined with varying durations of service commitment lengths. You have people that are serving for one enlistment if they're on the enlisted side, or 5 years if they're coming through a commissioning source. So that makes it very difficult to kind of identify, track, and compare different risk groups during this period of service and beyond, just because of all of these different complicated factors. And then kind of even more problematic, at least from a psychological perspective, despite the uncertainty of future treatment needs or understanding what these returning service members may need, currently available interventions, again, from a psychological perspective, have focused narrowly on extreme psychopathology, so typically post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is obviously not my chart, but for me, it's really the troop years that does it for me. So this kind of chart right here. So H.R. McMaster, former National Security Advisor to President Trump and one of the architects of the counterinsurgency doctrine, recently and prominently stated that, and it's, by the way, it's something I've heard from many people over the years, but he has a very large mouthpiece in terms of being able to say this, and he said it in a very elegant way, that the war in Afghanistan, and this can also be applied to the war in Iraq, that was not a singular war. It was 20 different wars fought 1 year at a time. This is a really profound idea. It's a profound idea, both from kind of, he was thinking about strategy, and it's a profound idea from a very strategic perspective, but thinking about it from a psychological perspective, we're talking about 3 million years of lived experience in a war zone. And what does that mean as we transition those service members back to civilian life? And as I said previously, so a large portion of funded research at academic Veterans Affairs and those affiliated with them have prioritized the research of PTSD. And it's because of that number I just showed you, that idea of there being that many years spent in a war zone. And as we kind of saw what happened post-Vietnam, we kind of made a vow to ourselves, both from a very societal perspective, but also from a psychological perspective, to never allow that to happen again. So post-traumatic stress disorder was included in the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, it's like our diagnosing Bible, in 1980. And it was a reason, and the reason for doing so was, again, kind of all this research post-Vietnam, and to make sure in the future that there was a way that we could identify what was occurring with our returning veterans. And as a result, a large portion, like I said, of funded research at academic VAs has prioritized the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, and then optimizing the efficacy of what we would call frontline treatments. And those frontline treatments are PE, prolonged exposure therapy, and CPT, cognitive processing therapy. And I think one of the previous courses that you all had earlier this year was related to these treatments. And these are considered kind of the gold standard of treating post-traumatic stress disorder. And as a result, and that's based on evidence, by the way, and as a result, the VA currently mandates the prioritization of those two treatments, prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy, for those who are diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And because we want to make sure that our providers are highly skilled, all of the providers are trained that are kind of treating post-traumatic stress disorder, so in the clinics that see that, are highly trained in PE and CPT. And then it's tracked with institutional performance measures. And there's obviously a lot of positive to this, but there's also a negative side to this. And the negative side of this is that we are kind of having this hyper focus on PTSD. And if we're focusing on PTSD, is it possible we're missing something else? And the unfortunate reality is that transitioning veterans who might need services often don't seek PTSD treatment. And this reluctance is driven by concerns about stigmatization that can carry over from time in service, that can just be something that is kind of community-based or community-driven, or it can be driven by any sort of identities, gender identity, racial identity, or religious identity. Additionally, there's kind of this idea that maybe they don't qualify or they don't meet criteria necessary to qualify for treatment. And we hear this a lot. This is veterans that think that they don't qualify for treatment. Or the other thing is that veterans will say, like, well, I don't have it that bad. I want somebody else. If there's only one spot, I want another veteran to have it. So either they believe they don't meet criteria, or they don't want to take up that spot. They want to make sure they give it to someone else. And then the other piece of it, reluctance is driven by treatment preference being in conflict with offered or prioritized services. So again, those prioritized services are that prolonged exposure, that cognitive processing therapy, and those are trauma-focused treatments, which I think I failed to mention just a slide ago. That means that those treatments kind of have the trauma that service member experienced at the core of the treatment, meaning they are going through kind of a constant exposure component to it, or almost a habituation component to that trauma. So there are a lot of veterans who don't want to do that for a variety of reasons, don't want to kind of come into full contact with that trauma. And so they have a different treatment preference. And there are other treatments that are kind of considered evidence-based treatments for PTSD. And one of them is present-centered therapy, which does not have the trauma at the focus of the therapy itself. However, currently in a lot of VAs, PCT is not offered as one of those kind of gold standard or frontline treatments. And that's, again, the prolonged exposure and the cognitive processing therapy. And even within those two that I just mentioned, the prolonged exposure, the cognitive processing therapy, a majority of veterans that receive those treatments continue to suffer elevated symptoms, and dropout rates remain extremely high. And this is, again, for a variety of reasons. And when Christy was introducing me, she was talking about how I really deeply believe in us better understanding the heterogeneity of the veteran experience, meaning you've met one veteran, oftentimes the same can be true in treatment, that these dropout rates can be for a variety of reasons, or there can be a variety of reasons why there's these elevated symptom levels even post-treatment. But what that also signifies to us, both as practitioners, as advocates, is that there's an urgent need for new types of interventions and supports that are outside of kind of these traditional prioritized two types of therapy, cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure. And the reality is that PTSD isn't that common. And we can acknowledge that a little PTSD is still a lot of PTSD, especially for someone who is suffering its effects. But broadly speaking, it's not that prevalent or as prevalent as it often appears either in the media or kind of in common day, like lexicon or conversations. Again, this isn't to undermine the insidiousness of PTSD. It's certainly not to say that it doesn't exist, because obviously it does, but just in general, that PTSD just isn't that common within the veteran population, though it does differ by kind of affected. There's like different buckets of risk groups, I'll say. But right here is kind of some more data on these PTSD prevalence rates. And I say that because it can be very shocking for someone to say PTSD is not common, especially for those who kind of very much want to make sure that we're bridging that gap between those that have the PTSD diagnosis and getting treatment for that diagnosis. But again, like I mentioned before, with a hyper focus on PTSD, is it possible we're missing something else? Or is it obscuring something else that might be occurring in the veteran space that's causing distress? Because PTSD does occur in a relatively small portion of returning veterans. So studies of veterans deployed in the most recent campaigns, so Enduring Freedom, Iraqi Freedom, Afghanistan, and Iraq, have estimated the range of PTSD between 4.7 and 19.9%. Now, the upper limits of these estimates is likely impacted by the quality of studies, meaning that the research methods used to get those prevalence rates weren't the most rigorous, but those that have used these very methodologically rigorous designs, which are prospective data collection, meaning you're collecting data before the event and then after the event, so you kind of have this baseline, and then population sampling procedures where you're kind of getting a population at large and not just getting clinical samples, have shown that PTSD rates are about under 10%. Now, 10% is still a lot of PTSD. Again, I want to make sure that we're acknowledging PTSD is real, it's insidious, 10% is still a lot of PTSD, but it's also not this 19.9 or 20% that we often see cited in the media. So again, as I've kind of said multiple times throughout this kind of presentation thus far, like, are we missing something, right? There's still very much veteran distress occurring. We obviously know the rates of veteran suicide have not been impacted by substantial numbers of dollars, programs, outreach efforts. So are we missing something? And so my argument would be, well, undoubtedly we're missing something with a hyper focus on PTSD. It's obscuring other potentially related issues as our service members are transitioning out and back to civilian life. And the idea that transition is challenging is not new, and it's certainly not mine. We've been recognizing for years the pernicious impact of failing to appropriately transition our service members, as all of those things that you saw I just put up, the kind of cascade of all of those different topics. We recognize from a very kind of colloquial or common sense perspective that something is happening. That something is happening when our service members transition off of active duty back into civilian life, that it causes some level of distress. But oftentimes, this kind of recognition has resulted in what I would argue are material solutions for what are seen as material problems, meaning job training, resume building workshops, things like that, that focus on those material needs while failing to address the psychological or the social psychological impact of leaving active duty and transitioning back into the civilian sector. So Janae, I don't know if you can go ahead and put up that first poll. But there we go. So I kind of already gave the answer, but is veteran transition stress a phenomenon solely related to economic and material factors? And I want you to answer honestly. Prior to this, is that something that you thought veteran stress was specifically related to? So go ahead and answer that if you feel comfortable doing so, just to kind of see where everybody's at. And I'm not sure, I don't actually know if I can see the responses to the polls on this. So we'll just kind of move forward, but just for your own edification, I want you to think about how you've conceptualized veteran transition stress in the past, and how might your conceptualization or your understanding of veteran transition stress may change after this time we spend together. Because really what we're doing is, oh, I don't know if I can change the slide now. Oh, there we go. We are, I told Christy earlier, I'm terrible at technology. Oh, here we go. So the host is sharing poll results. Perfect. So transition stress. So some people, yes, thought so. And then the bulk of you said that no, that's not the case. And so that's excellent. Oftentimes, I usually give this poll at the beginning, which I probably should have done, but most people think or conceptualize transition stress, again, as bucketed around these kind of more material problems, economic-based issues, getting a job, resume building, making sure you have a house to live in. That is not at all to underscore the importance of, or to mitigate or kind of water down the importance of those, but just that we broaden our definition and we try to better understand what's happening when our veterans leave service. Because what we're really doing is we're currently trying to define the undefinable. So what we know is that this is kind of unrelated to trauma, but at some level of psychological dysfunction or distress that is a result of a service member leaving active duty and transitioning back into the civilian sector. And the reason why this is undefinable is that currently there really is no kind of rigorous psychological research around transition stress. There's a lot of information and data around resource using, what that looks like in the first year. There's a lot of information about kind of suicide rates, but what's causing transition stress, the psychological dysfunction piece, there's not as much information there that can really begin to shed light on this problem. And maybe from a diagnostic perspective, maybe the closest thing might be like an adjustment disorder for those that are in this field, kind of an adjustment type disorder diagnosis. However, kind of from a very codifiable perspective, we don't consider the transition off of active duty to be a major life stressor. In fact, kind of societally, we see it as the opposite, right? Being in service is highly stressful. You have the potential to deploy, you have the potential to be exposed to potentially traumatic events. So the idea that leaving service is the traumatic event or a major life stressor in that regard is almost antithetical to what we kind of consider from a societal perspective. So like I said, so what causes it? What's causing transition stress or this kind of latent distress in the veteran population post-transition? Well, we really don't know. And it's not trying to be flippant or cheeky, but we really just don't know yet about what are the psychosocial causes of this. Again, from speaking not necessarily a material perspective, but the psychological processes that occur as someone leaves service. And so Janae can go ahead and put up that second poll. I'm really curious to ask all of you, what generation of veterans do you think struggle the most with transition difficulties? Do you think it was the World War II era, or so post-World War II era, the post-Vietnam era? Is it the post-9/11 era, or has it been our veterans that have served in peacetime? So I'm gonna go ahead and give you guys a few moments to answer that poll. I think I can submit too, so I'll answer my own poll. All right. So I don't know if Janae, when you can put those answers up, but I'll advance the slide so that we can see. All right, so Vietnam, so the bulk of you thought the Vietnam era, kind of second to the post 9/11 era, and then peacetime and World War II. So what I'm going to show you is that actually that is not the case, that currently what evidence suggests is that the transition is reported at higher, more difficult levels for post 9/11 veterans than those who served in any previous conflict or the periods in between, those peacetime periods. This is like a mind-blowing idea that the post 9/11 generation of veterans, which again is an all-volunteer force and is small comparative to those other levels of troop, except perhaps peacetime, but they are reporting higher levels of transition stress. And that is a remarkably ubiquitous experience. So I said the prevalence rates of PTSD, upper limits 20% for those kind of less methodologically rigorous studies. For those that are pretty rigorous, about 10%. As you can see here, population survey studies are showing that 44 to 72% of veterans experience high levels of stress during the transition to civilian life. That is a far more common experience than post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. And this can be related to a whole host of different things: difficulties securing employment, interpersonal difficulties during employment, conflicted relationships with family, friends, broader interpersonal relationships as you build them in maybe your new life, whether it's at school, at a new job, in a new neighborhood, difficulties adapting to the schedule or kind of like the ebb and flow of civilian life, and then just kind of broad legal difficulties. And perhaps even more significant is a slide I'm going to get to next. This is the last poll. So Janae, if you can go and throw that up there. And this is kind of the question of, why does this matter? Why does this transition stress matter? And so I want to ask this question: when do you think the majority of first suicide attempts occur for our veterans? Is it during the last 6 months of time in service? Is it during that first year post-transition? Or does it occur more than 12 months after transition off of active duty? So I'll give you a moment to go ahead and answer that. And now I'm going to give you the answer, right? So transition stress has been found to predict both treatment seeking and the later development of mental and physical health problems, including suicidal ideation. The majority of first suicide attempts by veterans occur after military separation, with that first year being particularly vulnerable. Again, this is like a mind-blowing concept to me. This idea of this first year post-transition is remarkably vulnerable, especially from a very anecdotal perspective. You speak to people transitioning off of active duty. It's the idea of like the grass is always greener. I'm going to leave service. Things are going to be great. I don't have to get up for PT anymore. I can do I have all the freedom to do all these different things. I don't have to put in a task to travel on the weekend. And there's almost this kind of a lack of recognition of what kind of adaptation to civilian life or reintegration to civilian life may look like. And so the kind of the most vulnerable period for our service members is that first 12 months post separation. And the previous administration recognized that first year was particularly vulnerable. They established 2 executive orders to begin to bridge that gap, allowing transitioning service members to access mental health care. But they also established the Prevalence initiative, which is kind of this very broad, open initiative to begin to address suicide from a public health perspective, pulling in partnerships across kind of a variety of contexts, faith-based initiatives, employment initiatives, mental health initiatives, things like that. And the reality is that as we're thinking about transition stress, I also want to acknowledge that there is no current programming that exists within the Soldier for Life Transition Assistant Programming. So that's the mandatory transitioning program that every service member is required by law, by kind of congressional order to attend. There is no module that addresses the psychosocial impacts of transitioning off of service. So thinking about that, thinking that we take basic training, advanced individual training, or MOS specific training, military occupational specialty training, in order to transition civilians into service members, we only offer 5 days of transition programming. And within those 5 days of transition programming, no current module kind of addresses the unique psychosocial impact of stopping to being a service member and becoming a civilian again. Now, there are optional wellness modules, and there certainly is connection to VA benefits. And this is by no means to undercut the really important work that Soldier for Life TAP does, but it's to acknowledge there's a gap. There's a very serious gap in how we are addressing the transition off of duty, because we make soldiers and we don't make them civilians again. We don't unmake them as they go and leave active duty. And there are a variety of risk factors associated with this. So for those that are kind of curious, well, what makes people more vulnerable to transition stress? Well, there's a couple different things that have been found, and that's reported emotionally traumatic exposure. So this is to differentiate from like combat exposure, for example. There are some people that don't report combat exposure as being emotionally traumatic. So we would call those potentially traumatic events, by where that they may be traumatic to that person, but if they've interpreted them as not being traumatic, we certainly don't want to kind of pathologize that or label it as being traumatic if they don't view it as such. But for those that view those events, whether it's combat-related trauma, military sexual trauma, training accidents, if they have reported emotionally traumatic exposure, that does increase their risk of transition stress or transition-related difficulties. So the enlisted rank is another one. And this is lower enlisted, some of it's age-related. So it's kind of a person there that looks older, but actually the most vulnerable age group is the younger age group. So those that are kind of in that at-risk group that are also at risk for higher levels of suicide and suicidal ideation. So kind of 18 to 25, and then 25 to 34, that kind of age bracket. And then substance use. Substance use is a significant risk factor for transition stress or transition-related difficulties. So I say all of this and it's like, okay, well, what do we do with that information? What is the role of our community partners and where do they fit in all of that? And so I want you to think back to that question I asked at the beginning about, who's responsible? Who is responsible for the transition? And I would argue, and I think a lot of people would argue, that we all are in some ways. It's actually not a defined mission by the Department of Defense. It's not really a defined mission by the Department of Veterans Affairs. So really, how are we going to begin to bring into all of these pieces to address this particular issue? Now, there's been a lot of improvements over the past few years as we've recognized, and I'm using the royal we, like more kind of the government apparatus, the private sector, have recognized the transition period as being particularly vulnerable. And there are still massive gaps that we need to fill. So where do community partners fit in all of this? So this is Maslow's hierarchy of need for those who aren't familiar with it. And this is kind of the pyramid that we use when we think about beginning to address needs for our service members as they transition out. How might you fit in this pyramid? So kind of first is that basic physiological needs. So air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, those type of things. So the things that you need to kind of survive. And the reality is that the risk of homelessness and food insecurity is particularly high in that first year post-transition. And we know that food insecurity is associated with higher levels of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. And SNAP participation among veterans is 10% higher in the first year post-transition than for the general veteran population. Meaning, again, that first year is particularly vulnerable for addressing these physiological needs, food and shelter in particular. And then as we move up that hierarchy of need, as we begin to think about it, the kind of the safety needs, so employment. And this is where a lot of organizations come in. This is where DOL has done a great work partnering with Soldier for Life to make sure that these resources and these things are given to our service members. But this is kind of where we begin to see the necessity of employment-based opportunities or outreach for our transitioning service members. And this is kind of, again, at the bottom of the pyramid, but economic strain like job loss, reduced income, difficulty covering medical, food, housing expenses may also increase an individual's risk for suicide. So just kind of a statistic to keep in mind, 37% of transitioning service members take 6 months to more than a year to get in a job, with a 6% unable to find a job. So we're nearly talking upwards, I'm not a math person, that's about 45%, a little bit less than that, of service members who struggle to find a job 6 months to more than a year after they transition off of active duty. That's a significant amount of time in which those who are undergoing that period of joblessness might experience that economic strain, which then informs that lower level portion of the pyramid, those physiological needs that are failing to be met. And then kind of as we move up that pyramid, thinking about loving and belonging, right? So service members report that they experience the deepest love of their lives, the deepest connections, the most intense social connectiveness during their time in service. And it's the reason why they often cite their fellow service members or brothers and sisters in arms as being the closest individuals in their life, not their spouses or not their civilian friends. And this is even after they transition off of active duty. And this social support, it's been widely studied and appears to protect against development of PTSD while they're still in active duty. But when you transition off of active duty, a bulk of those relationships become far more diffuse, either by geographic reasons or just kind of what happens in everyday life as you begin to kind of create distance between yourself and those you maybe had previous contact with during time in service. So kind of other statistics to keep in mind is that 84% of service members believe the civilian public does not understand their experience. 71% of civilians agree that they have a lack of understanding, and over half the civilian public say that the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had little impact upon their lives. Meaning the civilian military divide, it's not just a kind of a public policy statement. It is a psychological experience that our service members are having. They feel not understood, they feel alien in their own society, and that loving and belonging is a critical portion of them feeling integrated back into society. So organizations that target that are critical. And then again, moving up, thinking about esteem. So how can we have veterans begin to feel more highly regarded during their time in service? Service kind of particularly focuses on esteem. They build competency in a variety of different ways. They test service members on those skills. And as a result, most service members cite kind of have higher levels of esteem as it pertains to their employment or to their job or their military occupational specialty. That obviously becomes very impacted as they transition out. One of the most powerful stories I heard was a service member who was helping do village stability operations in Afghanistan. He was very young doing this. He had a huge role, kind of outsized role and responsibility. When he transitioned back, the only job he could get was being somebody stocking shelves at Home Depot. And that discrepancy of experience between being highly regarded, highly capable, in charge of individuals, back to only being qualified to stock shelves is a very kind of intense shock to the system from a psychological esteem perspective. And then thinking about self-actualization, right? So a lot of service members join for a variety of reasons. They could join for benefits, for patriotic reasons, for any number of things. And a lot of them still underneath all of that, even if it's like that primary reason is something like patriotic reasons or benefits, there still is kind of this underlying desire or pull for all of us, service members and human beings alike, kind of across the board, to become the most that we can be. And that oftentimes during the transition, that becomes impacted because of all of the reasons I just stated below. Lack of esteem in a job, feeling like they don't have anyone they belong to, and an inability to meet those physiological or those safety needs. So how do we close that deadly gap, which is what I referred to before? And here are kind of ways that we can bucket it. We can really look at, and by the way, I don't have the DoD and the Department of Veterans Affairs on here. They obviously have a role, but as they're not the focus of this talk, the focus is on community partners and local influencers. I want to make sure that we're targeting it there. So we know that kind of modern warriors, transitioning service members have unique and diverse needs, and very few of individual community organizations are capable of wholly addressing these needs, full stop. And there is nothing wrong with it. There is no expectation that one organization should be able to address every single one of these. But as a result, there's also kind of minimal synchronization across and among stakeholders because there's no central agency responsible in most places for vetting these entities' effectiveness. And there's really no agency that is going to hold these individual organizations accountable for service quality. Just kind of as we think through what roles do we have, how can we better address that? So the first one we're going to go over very quickly is the local government. So the way that local government can be more active in filling a sizable portion of this kind of disconnect is by leading in the synchronization of those resources, is by kind of creating opportunities to have collaboration across stakeholders and provide funding opportunities that support local initiatives. So that's one of the kind of the biggest things that local governments can do to better address transition stress. Now, additionally, they can create a no wrong door approach, meaning that veterans can kind of come in to any apparatus and kind of find their get appropriately directed to the resources they need, that there is no wrong door for them to enter. And then, like, as we were talking about thinking this idea of being these epicenters, become critical epicenters for all these local organizations to almost rally around. There are some great places that do this very, very well. Combined Arms in Texas is the first one that comes to mind, which is this epicenter of resources that and it's affiliated with local government, and they've been very good about partnering and doing collaboration so that when veterans kind of arrive, they're able to get all of those resources in one place. So the governor's and mayor's challenge to prevent suicide is kind of directly poised to assist local governments in leading this change and help them develop actionable solutions. So for those that are involved with local government, these kind of three resources, and by the way, I didn't put a citation here, but I'm happy to provide the paper afterwards. This is related to a peer-reviewed paper that appeared with myself and a variety of co-authors who are almost all post 9/11 veterans about how do we begin to kind of provide recommendations to key stakeholders across all these different apparatuses. So with regard to veteran service organizations, some of the biggest recommendations that we generated were avoiding mission creep. Do what you're good at and stick to that. I think it becomes very easy to want to kind of open up your organization. This most often comes from a place of absolute kindness and generosity and wanting to do as much as possible to help veterans. But mission creep can help water down individual veteran service organizations. And so the best thing to do is partner and refer. Who does this better than anyone else in the veteran service organization space? And how can I best refer them to that in order to make sure that their need is being met? Another recommendation is utilizing digital platforms as much as possible to begin streamlining this effort and giving veterans those choices and that opportunity to see the array of veteran service organizations that are out there. Because as I'm sure you all know, if you type veterans into the US Internal Revenue Service, it returns a listing of over 25,000 nonprofit organizations with a transitioning service member or veteran related mission. That's wonderful, and it can be extraordinarily overwhelming. So how do we help veterans kind of narrow their focus and figure out what they want to need, what they need and how to get there with an organization who is very good at that specific thing? And then where possible, integrating peer support and mentorship has proven to be highly effective in preventing suicide, but also improving the efficacy of programs. For employers, here are a couple recommendations that we generated. So pushing beyond hiring initiatives, making sure that you're not just kind of touting a line of we want to hire veterans, but integrating a kind of solidified strategy and ensuring that there's resourcing behind that strategy to make sure that you are not just hiring veterans, but you're retaining them. Veterans often leave their first job this happens for a variety of reasons. And a lot of times it's not necessarily employer's fault, but recognizing that the ability to recruit and then retain veterans is extraordinarily important. And having a strategy that addresses that and resources that is critical. Increasing veteran cultural competence. There obviously is a cultural component to service, especially as we think about an all volunteer service with less than 1% of Americans serving. What does that look like? How do we make sure that our employers understand what it means to be a veteran and dissipate some of the stigma associated with service? This isn't part of the presentation, but there is a lot of stigma around service, with a lot of Americans believing that service members who serve have a diagnosis like post-traumatic stress disorder. And then most Americans affiliate post-traumatic stress disorder with things like crazy and unstable. So how do we begin addressing that? And then creating employee-led affinity groups, making sure there's buy-in from the employee level that allows veterans to have that sense of loving and belonging, thinking of that hierarchy of needs. Now for colleges and universities, for those that's where they kind of hang their hat, there's a couple things that can be done. Committing to enrolling and graduating. This is similar to the employees, kind of for employers. Again, making sure that we're not just recruiting veterans, but we're finding ways to make sure we retain them and that we synchronize resources to make sure that as they come in, they are able to have access to local partners, whether it's the government or local veteran service organizations to potentially meet those needs that they may have as a transitioning service member. Collaborating with those external resources. Again, that's going to be those veteran service organizations and those local governments. And then again, expanding that multicultural competency training for teachers and for staff, making sure they understand the impact of service and not from a negative perspective, from a perspective of how much veterans bring to the table and how they can increase the diversity of that college, that university. But there are some complications. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, the increased effort of the VA and the DoD to understand and mitigate things like suicide for transitioning service members, it appears to have had little impact on reducing suicide rates, especially among those younger transitioning service members. And despite the imperative need for greater knowledge about all these different things, like long-term adjustment, suicide risk, most of the work, most of the research on integration, reintegration, and transition stress is very limited. And so subsequently, our ability to specifically target and develop programming that's going to address some of those needs is hamstrung by this lack of understanding. So kind of as we think through, okay, how can we help? Some of it is about making sure that we understand the problem before we solve it. So where possible, elevating research or opportunities to participate in trials, whether it's therapy trials or studies that look at different types of interventions that may help transitioning service members is one way that we can begin to bridge this deadly gap altogether. And the reality is the best recruitment tool for an all-volunteer force is a well-transitioned veteran. The better the veterans participate in our society, the more likely someone is to say, oh, service is a great thing. I want my child, my neighbor, my friend to serve as well. And so it helps us all because this matters to us all from both a psychological perspective, a national security perspective, a community-based perspective. Having well-transitioned veterans is just good for America in general. So I am about at time, so I'm happy to take any questions. So I also know I have questions here on the registration form, so I'm going to go ahead and pull those up. And I also see some in the Q&A block. Okay, so I'll address those first. Let's see. So the first question, I don't know, can you guys see the Q&As here? Maybe I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see them, and I don't know if I can see you guys, but I will be able to answer these questions. I hope that you'll be able to hear me. So the first question is, what about all the veterans with not yet diagnosed TBI? Isn't TBI like PTSD also a hidden wound of war that will impact veterans who have transitioned over the past 20 years? The answer is absolutely, right? One of the hallmarks of the fight in Iraq and Afghanistan has been concussive related disorders or injuries that occur as a result of concussive related effects, whether it's IEDs, the firing of certain weapons. So TBI is absolutely something that it must be understood and be addressed. That there's been kind of a lot of advancement over the past few years of addressing some of those things within the VA and the DoD, and kind of addressing and acknowledging this may be a potential impact is critical. And how do they kind of get those resources? So the first resources I would say it's always going to be with regards to TBI is going to be those medical professionals within the VA system. And the VA in most areas is very well equipped to address that, and if not, refer out. There's also some great community partners that are doing work around TBI, which I'm happy to provide for those that are interested. Okay, next question. So I want to be able to get through as many as possible. I know we're short on time because I know everybody wants a break before the panels. So is the transition stress possibly due to a loss of tribe? In Israel, where almost everyone serves, veterans are surrounded by veterans, and transition and suicide are much lower. Absolutely. For those that didn't see it, when I kind of put up those, the slide where I said that we're undoubtedly missing something, one of them was Sebastian Junger's book, Homecoming. He also has a book called Tribe. Certainly, that absolutely is something, right? And this is why my first question was, in the age of a post-draft world, so when not everybody serves, less than 1%, is there something uniquely, is there something very unique from a psychosocial perspective that's happening to these transitioning service members? I would say absolutely. I think it's related to that loss of tribe, and thinking of that loving and belongingness hierarchy, or thinking of Maslow's hierarchy of need, loving and belongingness. Most people feel alienated. Most veterans feel alienated when they transition out, and so they have lost their tribe. So what does that mean? How do we get that back? And how do we utilize veteran service organizations, community-based initiatives to make sure that loving, belonging need is met for those transitioning service members? Let's see. Oh gosh, there's so many great questions. What holistic services are currently provided for veterans who battled Agent Orange? Competing with a veteran that has encountered his fourth bout with lymphoma. Oh, that's so sad. Treatment stops each time he goes back into remission. Oh, I wish I had a better answer to that question. That unfortunately is not my area of expertise. I would say that the best, I do know that the VA has gotten better about a holistic perspective. There's a lot of what's called now the Whole Health Initiative within the VA system. And the Whole Health Initiative is meant to have that very holistic perspective for those that are suffering any war-related effects. That would be the first place I would say that individual should go. Do you believe that there are factors related to ethnicity when veterans return from deployment? This is a great question, and I wish we knew, and unfortunately we don't have that data. So I'm always like hesitant to speculate on something that we just don't have that much information about. I think it's certainly possible. We do know that the veteran transition experience is different by gender, that men and women experience the same levels of transition stress, but it differs the type of stress that they experience. As you might imagine, women are more often to experience difficulties related to childcare versus our male veterans. So there are things that are gender-based. So I imagine that might be the case. And that's certainly something that I think that we should be very interested in trying to make sure we understand. And what about the hidden wounds of war and National Guard and Reserves? Yes, it's such a challenging question. This is again about PTSD and TBI. So kind of resources for National Guard and reservists. I wish I had a better answer here. Unfortunately, I don't. But they obviously, because of the way the deployments have worked for reservists and National Guard over the past 2 decades of war, they've obviously been exposed to very similar, potentially related impacts of things that could give them TBI and obviously post-traumatic stress disorder. But I'm not really quite sure if there's specific resources for that individual population, National Guard and reservists. So I apologize for not knowing more there. And then since EMDR can be so effective in treating PTSD, is that therapy often available to veterans in addition to PE and CBT? This is a great question. This goes back to like, there's other evidence-based treatments. I mentioned present-centered therapy. EMDR is considered an evidence-based therapy for PTSD. And it is available in some VAs. It's not available in all of them. There is a prioritization, again, of that PE and that CPT and what are called the PCTs, which are the post-traumatic stress disorder clinical teams, so PCT. And they require PE and CPT as prioritized. Again, it's measured by these kind of institutional-based measurements. Though some VAs do offer those providers that have experience in EMDR, some places do have it, but it's not as widespread as PE and CPT. Let's see, do you feel that, oh gosh, I don't want to, Christy and Janae, please interrupt me if we need to stop. I know that I want to make sure everybody can get a break if they need to, but I also want to answer all these questions because they're so fantastic.
Let's do one more, Megan, and then we can wrap it up.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's see. Okay. Oh, so many good questions. Okay, so I will just as they came in, because I don't want to choose, I'll just do it by kind of timestamp order. Do you feel that being a volunteer makes it harder to transition home than being drafted on mental health? I feel that people stigmatize more now, and the volunteers feel that more than when there was a draft. It's a really interesting question. This goes back to what we were talking about as it relates to tribe, that there are more transition difficulties related to this generation of veterans, the post 9/11 generation of veterans, than any other previous war or the peace times in between. And the reality is we don't know why. Unfortunately, that question has just not been answered. And this kind of big one blinking in neon lights, like, why is this happening? And I think there's been a lot of speculation, a lot of hypotheses around this idea of loss of tribe, feeling disconnected from the community they serve, these kind of long deployments that take place over many, many, many years, the expectation that you serve, you come back, there's kind of an integration piece, but not really. So I think it's a whole host of reasons, but what we do know is this is a particularly vulnerable period for the post 9/11 generation of veterans, that it is harder to transition home for what we think is a variety of reasons that we're not quite sure than any other generation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan. Thank you for joining us today and really providing so much more insight to our community on this important topic. And I know there was a couple more questions I think that came through, and we'll try our best to send those over to Megan and get any additional feedback from her if she's able to answer it. So thank you so much, Megan. I do want to give you guys I think we have about an 8-minute break. So you can, take a bio break, grab some coffee, whatever you need. To keep going this afternoon, and we'll be back. We'll be having our first panel discussion that'll be focused on the impact of prevention and where this is heading. So we'll be back right at 2 p.m. Eastern time. Thank you all. We're going to go ahead and get started again. So thank you all for returning. And we'll be moving forward to introducing our first panel for this afternoon. We have a talented group of individuals working diligently in the military and veteran community that are joining us this afternoon to share more on their experience in research, practice, and policy. So I'm really excited to introduce Gilly Cantor, Director of Evaluation and Capacity Building at the Institute for Veterans and Military Families. We also have Dr. Daniel Perkins, the Principal Scientist at the Clearinghouse for Military Family Readiness at Pennsylvania State University. Meaghan Andros, she's the Senior Program Officer of Sustainability, Community, and Economic Development at the Heinz Endowments. And we have Nate Birnbaum, Research and Evaluation Analyst at the Institute for Veteran and Military Families. So I'm going to turn it over to Gilly to kind of get us started for this panel on the impact of prevention and where is this heading.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm very glad that Meaghan went first because I think her remarks were the perfect backdrop to this conversation. I'm not even going to have to go through a couple of things that I was not sure if I would want to explain as the sort of data backdrop for some of these things around transition stressors and how those span the different social determinants of health and are associated with psychological disorders and increased suicidal ideation and things like that. Suffice it to say that that's been the backdrop for our work for a long time and is one of the main reasons why I think the fact that those are happening concurrently with navigation of services still being a challenge cited by transitioning service members and reintegration into communities being a huge challenge, that it's really, really important that the communities take a system-wide approach. And I'm just going to talk about that for a minute and then I'll turn it over to panelists. But I just wanted to mention a couple of key things. One, there are subpopulations within the veteran population that have additional layered considerations when you're thinking about some of these things. So not all veterans are impacted equally by some of these challenges. I think the point that Meaghan made about some predictors or risk factors associated with these things happen well before service, and those things are often highly correlated with other demographics, identities, things like that, LGBTQ populations, other underserved populations, in rural areas, let's say, or I think also anyone who may not have an honorable discharge status. There are things like that that can compound some of these things. So the second thing is part of the reason why that's so critical is that, as we know, not everyone is enrolled in VA care and not everyone is eligible for VA care. So it's just really critical that communities are part of the solution and part of the systemic approach to looking at some of these great challenges. So with that as the backdrop, I just want to provide a little bit of context because I know a lot of you are participants in our AmericaServes networks, particularly I know in the Mid-Atlantic region and the Northeast region. Some of this will not sound new to some of you, but just by way of context in terms of the data that we've seen over the throughout 2020, which we know was a little bit of an odd year, but I think highlights even more why some of these things are really important in times of crisis. In 2020, just over half of clients seeking services through AmericaServes made more than one request. And of those, almost 80% of those were for requests that spanned the social determinants of health. So for example, food and housing or employment and transportation. And one other thing, Meaghan spoke about food and how that is often really highly correlated with some of these issues. During COVID, for the first time ever in our networks, food was the top need nationally. And so I think that it just really hit home for us that having this data and having a systemic approach and being able to be flexible in response and to lean into communication across sectors, across organizations is so critical. It's always critical, but it's especially critical when in times of crisis and when certain populations are experiencing something more acutely. So with that in mind, I just wanted to talk about a couple other things that that I think are important in that systemic approach. So one is that I think Meaghan did a really good job also talking about how local governments, VSOs, universities, all of them are important, as are non-VSOs. So sometimes the best organization to serve a veteran may not be a veteran serving organization. So I think that sometimes we've like affectionately called it getting outside of our bubble. I think that that can be really, really important for this population. And I bring that up because right now, I think there are a lot of efforts in the broader space that we're operating in right now that maybe at the time that some of our networks launched, it was a little bit of a different landscape and some of these systemic approaches seemed more disruptive, but now they're the norm. I think the term social determinants of health is well known at this point. I think there are a lot of, collective impact and collaboratives. Those approaches are no longer like a phenomenon, like they're just very common, I think, across a lot of other populations and the broader healthcare space. Given that, I think one of the things that I'm hoping that everyone will touch on a little bit is how it's important for the data we collect, whether through research or our work, is aligned with the direction of that broader healthcare space. I think that the more work that we all do and the more that we stay aligned, I think there's a lot of lessons for us to learn from what's going on elsewhere and a lot of lessons that we might have to provide to some others that are entering this work after we've been here for 5-6 years in some cases. And then lastly, I just want to talk about how some of our data is really, I think, demonstrative of trying to focus on not just reactive responses to requests, but also proactive. I think in part, some of the ways that I think about that has to do with thinking about not just risk factors, but protective factors. And Meaghan talked a lot about social connection and some of the things higher up on Maslow's and some communities that AmericaServes is operating in. And I know the same is true for AWP and for Combined Arms and others, that social connectivity is really, really, really important. And outreach-based services, particularly in times of COVID, have been really effective. And I think a lot of people are looking at now, what are the ways that we can focus even more on prevention, knowing that as of now, given that, on average, there's 2.5 requests per person in our networks, and 90+% of those make it to the right provider on the first try, and that the overwhelming majority of those are resolved successfully, like that's great. But like of those, where can we focus more even on prevention and like try to look at our data in new ways? And so with that, I'm gonna shut up, but I just wanted to tee that up so that each of the panelists can talk a bit about, like, I think our bright spots in research and practice and policy, and speak to like some of the ways that each of them through their work are looking at the data and thinking about how to bridge that deadly gap. So with that, I'm going to turn it over, I think, first to Danny to talk a bit about TVMI, and then we'll take it from there.
Thanks, Gilly. I think that was really good summary. I think actually it'll tie nicely with some of what I'll be sharing on. I guess I'm the geek. I need to have prompts, because otherwise I'll go off script too much. So I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint if I can. But to Gilly's point, I actually want to hit on something before I even go there. And I think that the point of reactive and proactive is really important. So some of the system has to be reactive. And as we saw with COVID, right, the data-driven system over time, you learn quickly that the issue of food insecurity was moving to the top. So there was a need to be reactive to this issue, right? But the proactive part to me is thinking about both risk and protective factors and what has presented and what questions should we ask to see if there are other ones that we haven't actually looked at or explored yet that could play out. So just to say that real quickly, okay, I'm going to try to do this smoothly, which I generally don't do smoothly. So we'll accept that I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint real quick here. Here we go. Okay. See, when you have a small screen, it's not good. When you have two screens, it's much better, but I don't. Okay, here we go. Hopefully you're all seeing that. I'm going to blow it up here. Sorry, I just can't do everything at once here on these. Okay, so here we are. I'm going to skip that slide. I'm going to talk a little bit. The data which I'm talking about is drawn from TVMI, or the Metrics Initiative. It's a 3-year longitudinal study where we looked at a sample of about 10,000 veterans. We drew from a population of separating veterans. And then when we run analysis, we weight up so we can talk about representativeness of folks that got transitioned out real quickly. If I can just, oh, there, okay. Just a lot of folks know this, but there's 6 waves of data collection. The first wave, folks were either just got out the day before they did their survey or within 3 months. And then we followed them almost for 3 years, where we looked at what kind of issues did they have related to well-being, related to program usage, and really tried to see how those things play out. And we're going to present a few things. Gilly touched on a couple of them, so it's really good. I really appreciate her teeing it up nicely there. This slide, I won't spend a lot of time, which is all this slide does is tell you the sample matches up to the population pretty well. There's a few spots it doesn't. So for example, we have fewer Marines than the population, but then we weight, right? So we can go back up to that percentage there. Okay, so this slide here, it really is a sort of a, just to give everyone the work you're doing around connecting people to the right resources, if you will. It goes on, right? Everyone assumes people will transition. Like there isn't an end date for the transition. We haven't figured that out too well yet, or we don't have enough data, or we haven't looked at it enough yet to understand when do we feel like most folks have transitioned out and they're good, they're set, right? And the reality is, if we go 3 years out, people are still making use of the programs available. These are VA and non-VA or community-based programs that are out there that are being used. So that's this slide really shows, is that folks are making use of programs, and it's 3 years out. So I think one of the things we need to make sure is trying to figure out how we make it clear that that's okay and it's normal, and we should continue to have these conversations along the way. If I look at this slide, what I want to say is this just quick snapshot in time. We wanted to ask, well, why are people not using programs? And so we took the employment program. We wanted to look in wave 1, who was using, who wasn't, and what were the reasons. And I think some of these numbers really point to the need of figuring out ways to outreach, to continue to share the message of what we do and how we do it, and how we can help folks make the right connections. I think that's what really comes through on these numbers. I'm going to take a minute here and go through these numbers. So one of the things I wanted you all to think about is in all the programs and services you work with, is to use data to think about, well, where should I send folks to based on their needs? And there are some things we've learned already. And this is, you're not going to really, I would love to say we're going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but this slide just shows you there are certain things that work really well. So for example, if we were talking about an employment program, we know that an employment program that's offering interviewing and mentor coach, that a person who doesn't have a job who gets that component is 2.8 times more likely to have a job afterwards than a person who hasn't experienced that. That actually number goes up to 3.2 if we were talking about African-American males. So again, we've even been able to say, to Gilly's point earlier, there's not all veterans are equal in what they need or how they approach things. And we need to think about that in terms of what we're offering and how we try to sort of offer things that make sense. So from a prevention standpoint and understanding prevention standpoint, it's really understanding what are the needs of that individual and figuring out what do we know from the science to guide us a little bit. I just want to show you this because I think we can start to understand who's struggling with. This is a great, I think it's a really interesting slide of who leaves school, whatever type of school it is, early, doesn't get that associate's degree, technical degree, bachelor's degree. What are some of the challenges? And I'm going to highlight one there. You can look at PTSD symptoms and see that. So if somebody's contacting me with concerns of PTSD and I'm connecting them to the resources and I understand they're in an educational program, whatever that program is, I immediately, that should trigger, oh, there's a risk associated to them being in an educational program that we probably need to make guard against at this point. They are going to maybe struggle a bit more than someone not demonstrating that. So how do we make the link or the referral to the appropriate source? And what does that look like? And then this slide, to me, it takes a minute to digest. So the lines don't seem far apart. And it's really asking among the veterans with health symptoms at wave 1 who were matched, how many days did they report having those health symptoms, right? 2 is 8 or more days over a 2-week standpoint, over 14 days, or 1 is, several days, less than 8, really, over a 2-week period of time. And what we see here is that both lines sort of seem like they're on the same trajectory down, which is good. But the thing to see here is that the folks that are making use of counseling start off a lot higher, and their trajectory down is faster. In the end, it's significantly faster. It may not appear that way because of the look here, but really it is significantly faster. So if we can get folks that appear to need services into those services, they seem to work. And I think that's a message we should try to hear. Just two more slides, I think, that really get at this notion of mental health problems and some of the issues of how do we destigmatize that. And you may wonder, well, what to, prevention, if they're having mental health problems, are we really going to be dealing with prevention or is it intervention? What we do know is, and Gilly touched upon this and the other speaker did too, right? We know that if there are things in a person's past, as well as going through the military and having some other experiences to combat exposure stuff, those things can pile up. And while they may not present right away, there might be some early signs that if we were to connect them quickly, we might be able to thwart the spiral that's going to happen. So we see that 40% of veterans in our sample, and our sample, again, representative sample here, report meeting some mental health criteria, whether it is depression, anxiety, suicidality. However, only 1/4 of those veterans, of that 40% veterans, only 1/4 of them really believe they had a mental health problem. Okay, so that tells me they're not going to come to you with, hey, I think I have some mental health challenges that I'd like to address. And so it's our job to figure out if that's something we need to, if that's one of those things we need to connect to. Is there some signs that potentially that's an issue? You're not going to be 100% right all the time, but it means it's an area where you could be preventative. If you see something that just kind of concerned about that, some risk behavior, some lack of a lot of social connectedness, you might then raise the bar and make a referral, even though they didn't ask for it, and explain that, we found that it's been a tough time with COVID. People are really struggling, feeling isolated. I'd like to make this referral to you to think through it. And that's that preventative mindset of using data that you're getting as you're talking to the individuals. And you could see the other, I'm not going to go into all the details. I just want to give you a smattering here of this. And again, I want to leave it a good note and to say veterans who use counseling service for mental health improve their depressive symptoms. We see this across all the waves, but we see that improvement from wave 1 to wave 6 to be very meaningful and significant. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over, I believe, to Meaghan Andrews, who will probably move us on to something else. And I would say put your seatbelt on, because that's usually my experience in working with Meaghan.
That's a lovely introduction. Thank you, Danny, for that. I think so. I'm here today to talk. I'm a funder, right? I work at the Heinz Endowments, which is in Pittsburgh. I'm coming to you from my 6-year-old's room. It's very professional, but really from Pittsburgh. And I think I want to talk a little bit about where do I think this whole thing is headed. And by whole thing, I mean the practice of navigation. In order to do that, I think it's helpful to know, so the Heinz Endowments is the 50th largest foundation, give or take a bit, in the country. We have about $2 billion in assets, which is a lot of money. It's not my money. But every year we're investing about $2 million on military veterans and family members, mostly in the Pittsburgh region. But we also fund a bit at the national level because there's a lot of money, and a lot of the conversation and the policy happens at the federal level around this population, obviously. But I will say that being in the foundation, 2 million is going to this population, but another 68 to 70 is going to different parts of our community. So I've had a unique ability for the last 8 years I've been at the endowments to sort of see how this population is the same as, but then also how this population is different from the other vulnerable populations in our community. We are the endowments, and in our military and veteran giving, we are one funder. Unfortunately, we all pursue different strategies. Some sit state level, some sit federal, some sit community. I think you all know that. So just wanted to put that out there and say that I speak for just myself and just a foundation that sort of does have a definitive focus on Pittsburgh. Also would be remiss not to say that our philanthropy in this space is somewhat comes from my own military transition experience. I was on active duty for 5 years. And so a lot of what I experienced coming out of the service, I sort of lean on in our practice of philanthropy. So I think navigation, what we've done, we were an early investor of the AmericaServes network. We're coming up, I think, in Pittsburgh. Hello to everyone on the Pittsburgh team that I'm assuming is here, but we're coming up on 6 years. They've done all the work. I've done none of it, just been sort of the silent partner behind the scenes. So I want to give them the credit for all this great work. But I think what we feel like we've done, and I think the data sort of shows it, is that navigation started in the vet space. It likely started as a result of post 9/11 veterans coming home, the VA playing a large role in the lives of veterans, especially those obviously that are eligible. As Gilly mentioned, there are many who are not. There are even more that decide not to register with the VA and primarily seek services in the community. But the VA has a really narrow mission, and you all know, they don't do legal, they don't do financial, they don't touch your family members, they don't do transportation oftentimes. So I think we should all be proud of sort of being at the forefront of this navigation conversation. I think what I'm now though seeing in Pittsburgh is that other sectors of our community, be it the arts sector, human services, immigrant, reintegration from prison, or criminal justice involved folks, these sectors are all sort of starting to talk about navigation. They're starting to come to our foundation and ask for funds to help with navigation. And I think there are implications for both what we as our community does in Pittsburgh, to what we've learned in AmericaServes, how AmericaServes continues to mature, but then also, how the rest of our community learns from AmericaServes. And I think we're in an interesting sort of inflection point. Maybe we should talk about this a little bit, or we'll get there. But in Pittsburgh, we're sort of confronting: should all of these systems talk? Should the data fields all look the same so that we can understand holistically how people are doing? Should there be a separate system for immigration? Should there be a system for folks who have immigrated? Should there be, or our refugees? Should there be a separate system for folks involved criminal justice system? What about new and vulnerable moms? What about, there are all these populations of people, and I think I see our community struggling with that. I think there's been where this headed, I think there's been, and I think Nate will get into this a little bit, but there's been some really great progress federally recently with the passage of the Commander John Scott Hannon Mental Health Act of 2019. There's another word in there that I'm forgetting, but but I think there's also a risk right now, and I think we've touched on this a little bit, that the success of the reintegration of the veteran population in our community and in communities across the country does not rest and should not rest only on VSOs. And as Gilly mentioned, oftentimes you're better off going to a legal organization that is an expert in family law, as an example, than a VSO who has expanded their mission to also do legal cases. And so I think where this is headed is it's exciting that finally at the federal level, they're starting to recognize and understand that navigation is important. The data that we've collected from PAServes, I think, makes us feel really confident that we've changed the lives of, I think, almost, or maybe just over 10,000 people now and connected them to resources quickly, efficiently. I think we can feel really good about that. But there's this danger that money coming from the VA keeps it in the vet space. And I think drawing these hard lines between you're a veteran, you go to vet organizations, you're a civilian, you go to civilian organizations. I think one of the questions that I've seen is, there are folks coming back to our community and they're not asking for help. Well, they're probably connecting with community organizations, but community organizations aren't asking them if they're veterans. So starting to have conversations about, our human services system needs to identify people as veterans. And if they're veterans, get them to something like in our community of PAServes to navigate, but vice versa. Our PAServes organization also needs to understand that even if somebody's a military veteran, it's perhaps they're best served outside of the vet space. So I think these navigation efforts are bringing up some really great questions that I think we're going to have to wrestle with in the years to come, both at the county for us in Pittsburgh, at the state. Our state is also having conversations both in the human services system and the Department of Military and Veterans Affairs about navigation. Then clearly at the federal level, how does the VA work with these community entities in partnership? What does the data look like? I think there's a lot to talk about. I think I will stop there. Gilly, go to you or Nate, and then maybe if we have questions later on, we could dive into any of that stuff.
Yeah, I think we can go to Nate to talk a bit about some of the policy implications, and then if we have time, we can answer some questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, team. I'm really just gonna build on a lot of what's already been said, and as it relates to policy at the state, local, federal level, I can definitely reiterate that what's been said, which is that there's been a definitive recognition on behalf of policymakers, leaders, folks in Congress, folks in executive agencies, that service navigation and coordination of services as sort of a preventive mechanism for terrible downstream effects is a really important strategy. And so in that regard, there has been a lot of really incredible progress. And Meaghan did an excellent job rattling off the top of her head the piece of legislation that passed last year, which I'll just call the Hannon Act. I'll keep it easy for me. But so that was a piece of suicide prevention legislation that passed at the end of 2020. And in that bill is a grant program that's basically, the VA's attempt to get money to community-based organizations to coordinate or provide services that would prevent veteran suicide. And the sort of definition of services that prevent veteran suicide is purposefully broad to include social determinants of health, to include things like housing, finances, nutrition, the sorts of things that we've been talking about here. And also the fact that we're including both language to provide services in-house on behalf of a grantee or to coordinate those services. And so the sort of legislative intent of that bill is to not only get money to community-based organizations to provide needed mental health interventions, but also to sort of invest in this community and network and system model that we've been talking about here today. And so that's sort of one example of the federal government making a real purposeful investment. It's going to be $174 million, this grant program, over 5 years. So it's a really significant investment. And, we're still answering questions, and the VA is still figuring out sort of how exactly they're going to roll out this grant program and who's going to get grants and these sorts of questions that are really important. So we don't really know exactly how it's going to go, but we know the legislative intent. We also know that the VA has been signaling that they care about this approach in their suicide prevention strategy. So, there's a pretty good chance that they're going to roll this out, at least, in tandem with other types of strategies with the coordination approach in mind. And that's really one example, right? One of the things, though, that I think it'll be important for us as advocates and for you all as experts to monitor is this point about silos and this point about making sure that we're getting out of our bubbles. So Gilly and Meaghan talked about, getting out of our bubble in the veteran space. But even within the veteran space, within federal programs, there's risk of a lot of different bubbles too. So, the VA is implementing this new grant program. The VA is also piloting a new healthcare navigators pilot. The Department of Labor is piloting a new employment navigators pilot. The Small Business Administration has got a small business navigators pilot. So, and this is all good. It's all representative of the fact that the federal government is recognizing these services are needed. But it also is something that we need to monitor, because if all of our navigation efforts are siloed, then it could be potentially self-defeating, right? So, and that's just within federal, veteran-oriented programs. That has nothing, that's not to say anything about state programs or local programs or non-veteran coordination programs that other federal agencies might be administering. And so that's something for us to monitor and continue to understand that there's sort of opportunity for you all to continue to lead the way in terms of, you've been doing this work for the last 5 to 10 years. You've been sort of figuring out the kinks of how to do this work, coordinate systems, coordinate programs and services. And so government is now catching up and recognizing that need, but they're going to have to figure out all the sort of same problems. So that's really sort of an overview of where I think, this stands, and in a lot of ways is in really good shape, but there are things for us to monitor. More specifically, being the political savants that they are, Everymind scheduled this event to be right after the president dropped his budget request. And so that actually can tell us a lot about sort of the policy priorities of the administration and, across not just at the VA, but at the Department of Labor and other agencies as well. So, we've taken a look at that budget request, and there's a lot of really promising things that we're seeing there. And I mentioned a few, there's a lot of stuff about navigation of services. The Hannon Act is supposed to be fully funded. Some other things that might be relevant to this group is the VA sort of announced that the Hannon Act grants aren't going to get rolled out until the year 2022, maybe even 2023. And so that's something that, we've been sort of monitoring and hearing about. It had been unclear as to when the first grants would go out. But, that's something for us to keep an eye on. What we're hopeful is that, the VA is taking its time because they want to get it right. And so we appreciate that. And that's fair. What we hope happens is the VA has now concluded their sort of implementation phase of collecting public input. As some of you may know, they opened up the Federal Register so folks and organizations could submit public comment on how they think the grant program should be implemented. And then a couple of weeks ago, they actually had a listening session where organizations could send a representative to talk about how they think the program should be implemented as well. So, that's really excellent that the VA has sort of opened up for public input, but there's also a lot of different sort of competing opinions on how this grant program should be implemented. And not to say that necessarily one opinion is better than another, although I'm sure, there are people who say, there is one opinion that's better than the other, but it will be sort of interesting to see, knowing that some people think that these grants should really just go to organizations providing emergent mental health services to veterans and their families. Some people think that we should take a broader, more systems approach. And that, that's sort of what we're talking about here today. Some people think that it should be funding, really innovative, future facing whole health type initiatives, different sort of things that are being provided in the social sector that VA maybe isn't providing from a clinical standpoint. So that's all to say that there's a lot of sort of competing ideas as to what this grant program should be used for. I don't know anything, but my guess is that it will be a combination, depending on the sort of leadership in specific communities and the needs of specific communities. So, and that's the right answer, right? So, while it's taking time for this grant program to roll out, the current timeline is a little bit longer than we expected. I would say that, it'll be interesting. The important thing is that it will be interesting to see, what the VA releases between now and then about, what they expect to do in terms of, implementing this grant. I'll also say that, the president's budget request identified a few other interesting things, some good, some, things to monitor. So a good thing is that they're going to fully fund the governor's challenge to end veteran suicide, another $35 million to expand that program to all 50 states. And, Gilly participates in a governor's challenge working group here in New York State. Our experience with that program is that it's a really innovative approach to bringing together all types of different experts to think through how can a state take a sort of cross-sectoral evidence-based approach to ending suicide, which includes the things that we're talking about today, network coordination of services, network approach, system approach, figuring out how do we get systems of data to talk to each other, both, at the county level, at the state level, and all sorts of different ways. So that program being fully funded, expanded to all 50 states is really promising. A couple things that we were hopeful would be funded that we didn't at least see mention of in this first iteration of the budget is another piece of legislation that passed last year is called the Mulder Act. Included in that bill is another grant program. This one not focused on providing and coordinating suicide prevention services, but providing and coordinating transition services. And the first panel that we had today did such an excellent job, talking about the specific importance of transition. And so all of these things are related. That's a piece of legislation that, we were very high on, that we think could have an immediate impact in communities, particularly impacting that point of transition. That's not something that was included in the president's budget submission. The chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Committee Economic Opportunities Subcommittee, Chairman Levin out of California, actually in the HVAC presidential budget, oversight hearing, asked the Secretary of the VA about that specific program. And so they're going to go back and sort of, dig into whether or not they're intending to fully fund that program, if that's something that was just left out due to level of detail, or if that's something that we're going to have to keep an eye on. So again, that's another example of another grant program, another coordination program, another investment on behalf of the federal government to let communities do their thing, coordinate services, take a network approach, but it's something that, we sort of need to keep an eye on and make sure continues. So at a high level, the takeaway is there's a lot of investment, there's a lot of interest, and there's a lot of recognition on behalf of government and policy that this is a necessary approach. As with anything that's complicated, it will be about making sure that the experts are empowered to lead the way and help figure out problems as they come. So I'll stop there, and I guess, Gilly, we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, happy to answer questions. I'm just realizing I responded to a comment that I think was only sent to panelists. So I want to read it because I think it's really great. So Ruth Cole said that, she said, I believe that a hybrid model of service provision may be the best model for the clients. I work in human services, and our program asks persons if they are veterans. The information is then used to provide services that are best taken care of in the public sector, and for needs that cannot be filled by human services, those needs are forwarded to the VA. I believe that it is important to understand that no one program can provide all the services that veterans need. We also need to stop duplicating and having us against them mentality when providing services to veterans. We do not want to make systems navigation more difficult, but rather more accessible to veterans. That couldn't have said it. I feel like that's the conclusion to all of these remarks. But I do think I just want to double down on some of the comments about the governor's challenge and just note that for all the states that are participating, there are 3 strategies that have been outlined as central. Like each state has to come up with their own approaches within these 3 strategy lines. And the first strategy is around identifying veterans and service members and their families. So do you know who lives in your state that's military connected? What are you doing to screen, to identify them and screen? So I think there's a broad recognition that just asking the question is central to success across all of these efforts, to alignment, to all of these things. So the vast majority of states are implementing some kind of ask the question campaign. Most state teams include non-VSOs, include broader health and human service agencies. So I think that to the same point that Nate was making about the direction and the recognition of these approaches, I think states are at the federal level, I think states are too, and that's ideally trickling down. And I would just say that for especially those of you on this call that are working directly in communities, I think one of the best things that organizations like you that care about serving this population can do is advocate for asking the question. It sounds so simple, but it's really critical, and just trying to find out, if your state team is doing something like that, find out how they're asking the question, try to keep your data aligned with their data. It's one of the best things that I think can be done across the country, just to have a better picture of what's going on and where people are and what they need.
Haley, can I put a fine point on, I think, just on 2 things. One, if you are a provider, you work in one of these networks, be it an AmericaServes networks or one of the others, hopefully one of the things that you're sort of taking from this conversation is that we are all on the sort of, I hate to use the term, but like the front lines of this, of this movement. And it is really messy right now, and it's very complicated, and the science is evolving quickly. So, when we use the term navigation, it could be a spreadsheet or it could be a team with social work backgrounds supported by technology. And no one's definitively I think there's some studies underway to sort of define that and understand what the difference in outcomes is from someone who uses a sortable spreadsheet to someone who uses a navigator with a tech platform that measures how well people get connected. So I think, as frustrating as the work I am sure gets on a day-to-day basis, know that it's really important what's happening, and it's finally being recognized by the federal government as being necessary for this population. And then there are other parts of our government, including human services, that are starting to understand the implications for their sector too. Then the other thing I just wanted to say also is I think the reason for bringing policy into this conversation is, when you look at human services in Allegheny County, they work in 26 or 28 different areas. They connect people to transportation and mental health and physical health and children, youth and services and, aging, housing, all these areas. And they only require veteran status in housing and aging. So we're not asking it in mental health. We're not asking it in a lot of other places. And really the way to do it likely is a federal policy move here, which is why they are asking it in housing, because the last 10 years have seen crazy amounts of veteran homelessness. And so the government, HUD, got together with the VA, which got together with the human services system and required it to be a mandatory field. I think we might be moving in that direction, which is why this conversation has to involve sort of where are we headed? Where's this movement headed? It's policy, I think, needs to be brought into the discussion. I'm going to stop talking, but I just, in case, because we're all over the place, maybe sort of to just be explicit about those 2 things.
And we did have one question in the chat that asked the name of the grant. Did you guys want to clarify that for them? Maybe Nate can help with that one.
Yeah, so there is a specific name of the grant program now. The name is Staff Sergeant Parker Gordon Fox Suicide Prevention Grant Program. So that it does have a specific name, and it has its own website now on the VA as well that gives some details. You can't, as an organization, go and apply for grant funding yet, but it does exist now. So great question.
My only shout out would be, I worry a little bit when we say we're using evidence-based if we don't have a definition of evidence-based, because my experience would suggest we probably aren't using evidence-based. It's certainly the case that in many areas, folks are all well-intended, and I think are approaching it thoughtfully, but that doesn't mean there's evidence to suggest they're getting to the outcomes you want to get. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that unless you test for it and understand it, you're probably not getting to the outcomes you want. So I do want to push back in a good way to say we need to really be thoughtful as you move forward to think about how are you defining evidence and how are they defining evidence, because I think it becomes a real big issue down the road.
And I think that's a big question as part of the grant program about what to measure in terms of how to assess the effectiveness of the grant. And some of our feedback on that has been to try to do a combination of the types of measures that you can do at a system level, like we do a lot with our networks, and that I know other networks do the same, like, connecting people to care quickly, using provider reported outcomes, things like that. But that also organizations will need support in trying to collect those well-being outcomes over time, because it's challenging, expensive, requires a lot of expertise that not everybody has. So I think that that's going to be really, really critical. And then I also think that evidence-based also applies to some of the approaches to navigation and coordination that Meaghan was talking about, where right now there's not a lot of data or evidence to suggest which types of coordinated models work better than others. And that's something that I think we're also really interested in. And I know Meaghan's supporting some new research around that subject, or the Hines endowments are supporting, I should say, where trying to understand the difference between what, and not saying that some are necessarily better or worse, but rather what are the ways, I would say, that some are, like, where are certain approaches more effective than others? In some places, a resource directory or a spreadsheet may be adequate because it's a small community or something to that effect. But in other places, maybe primarily an outreach-based approach works really well. In other places, something that's more hub and spoke might work really well, things like that. So there isn't even a lot of evidence to suggest which of those work best under which circumstances. And so that's another area for research to focus on.
Gilly, should we answer, Wendy submitted a question.
I saw that. I think that was geared toward Meaghan, but I'm not sure.
So can I just, things that are going through my mind here, her question about how do we find people that are struggling but are not self-identifying or are not connecting or don't feel like they're worthy of the resources? To me, it just emphasizes or reiterates me, or makes me want to reiterate that they're showing up in community organizations, but maybe they don't feel like they're eligible or don't know that they're eligible for VA care. I keep having conversations with our human services system about how if you're not asking whether people are veterans that are coming to you, for example, with complex health needs, or let's stop there, complex health needs, it could change someone's life if they realize that they are eligible for that VA care. So I think the civilian sector needs to understand that it's about access, and it's about they need to better understand what makes a person eligible and how to assess that. And I think, for our network in Pittsburgh, as an example, can return a DD-214 very quickly and get someone enrolled in care. But if the human services system or the Hill House, which is a great nonprofit here in Pittsburgh, doesn't connect the dots that the person served, they'll never ask that question, and then they'll never get connected. So I think going back to what are our required fields that we're all asking, regardless of the space in which, or the sort of place that we work in, and also real recognizing or talking openly about veterans are community members oftentimes, more than they are people who have served, or they are also community members. I think sometimes that gets lost on folks. If that makes sense.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for your thoughts and input in this panel. And I just, again, thank you, Gilly, Danny, Meaghan, Nate, for your insight and shared expertise on this topic. I do want to go ahead and move forward. We're about to move into our next panel, but I do want to give you guys a little bit of a 5-minute break, just to bio break or refresh your coffee, whatever it needs to be. And we'll be coming back at 2:55 for our final panel that will be focused on in your community, the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast discussion. Thank you so much. All right, we'll be getting started on our second and final panel, so everybody can return. Thank you all for joining us today. And as I mentioned, we'll be moving forward, introducing our final panel for this afternoon. We are joined across the region by our AmericaServes Coordinated Network leadership to share insights from their community level efforts in terms of prevention and coordinated care. So I'm really thrilled to introduce Vincent Del Sorno. He is the Community Services Program Manager at the Institute for Veteran and Military Families, who will be moderating this discussion. So I'm going to turn it over to Vincent. Thank you, Vincent.
Thanks, Christy. Good afternoon, everybody. As Christy mentioned, my name is Vincent Del Sorno, and I'm Program Manager at the IVMF, and it's my pleasure to be moderating this panel. So with us today, we have our very own Christy Kennedy, who's been emceeing this. So she's going to be part of this panel. Looking forward to asking her some questions from the Serving Together Network. Natasha Bougie from Mission United South Hampton Roads. We have Dave Dos Reese from Rhode Island Serves, covering the state of Rhode Island. Amari Espinal from New York City Veterans, the Department of Veteran Services for the City of New York, and Aaron Melius with PA Serves. So just want to make sure everybody's locked in, good to go. All right.
I think Vince, everybody's here except for Amari, but we'll go ahead and get started. If he joins in, we'll turn it over to him here shortly.
Okay, perfect. So I wanted to kick the discussion off this afternoon by just posing a question to everyone. And if we could go down the line, Christy, I'll start with you. And then if you feel comfortable handing off the mic to somebody else, but just asking a general question in terms of how do you see your role in supporting transition in the communities that you serve?
Absolutely. So a couple of things, Serving Together really has, a unique region compared to many of our other AmericaServes communities. We really support military and veteran populations across 3 jurisdictions. That includes Maryland, District of Columbia, as well as Northern Virginia. And so we've recently also expanded to serve Central Maryland and the greater Baltimore community. So really that means collaborating across local, state, even national organizations. And since we are operating here in the national capital region with providers representing thousands of nonprofits, veteran and military serving organizations, numerous government entities and more, really transition to our team. And as kind of many of our speakers and panelists have highlighted, is that it could be really any stage in life when a military or veteran family is transitioning from one means to another, whether that's joining military service, maybe during a permanent change of station move, maybe it's during separation or retirement. That could even just be as they've transitioned out of the military, they're changing between jobs or different life stages, having children, getting married, whatever the case may be. So we really serve the entire lifespan of our military and veteran population. And the mission of our team is to ensure that we have a seamless connection to the many available resources in the community, or that the community that they're moving to, whether it be moving to our community or moving to another one. So this means we have to really do the work to understand those organizations and entities that are available, understand the eligibility requirements, keep in touch with those organizations to know when they're at capacity, as well as ensuring that when a client does need support, our team of peer navigators are really connecting them to the best resources based on their need. And so that's what we look at when we're looking at supporting transition in our communities, the entire lifespan, working across this region from all these different jurisdictions and all these different agencies and partners to really collaborate and make sure that our military and veteran families get connected to the right resources.
Aaron, why don't you go next?
Well, yeah, just to piggyback sort of what Christy said is what we also try to do is we try to be educators in the community to make sure that when we have veterans' attention, we have the opportunity to educate them on all the different programs that are there to help enrich their lives. oftentimes they don't know most of these programs exist. So we take on that role of educating transitioning veterans, meeting them where they're at, whether they're still in a guard unit or they've in their freshman year of college, or they're just in other organizations. We take that time to not necessarily talk about serves, but talk about the multitude of organizations here in Pittsburgh and how they can help enrich their lives. So we do that along with just trying to educate them on what's out there.
Great. Natasha.
Yeah, so at Mission United in South Hampton Roads, initiative of United Way, we actually, like Christy said, we kind of serve the entire lifespan of the veteran. However, we like to get started well before they are transitioning out. So we actually serve active duty military as well. And one of our main goals is to partner with as many organizations and people as possible that provide services to active duty and veterans, so that that transition in our area is seamless. We are a central access point for resources and services in our area. So we really try to connect as many people as we can so that we can be that one-stop shop for veterans and active duty military who are on their way of transitioning or just in need of services and resources in our area outside of the military, be it be a confidentiality situation or something that they just would not like to get back to their command. We offer support in many ways through the different partners that we have in our area.
Awesome. So just a quick disclaimer, it seems that we also lost Dave. So, but Natasha, don't turn your camera off because I want to actually stick with you. So I know that we were talking through a little bit earlier in the program just around sort of this concept of trying to stay out of the veterans bubble if we can help it, right? So, and making sure that we're building relationships and making sure that there's a strong enough partnership that exists both within and outside of what, you know, we could call the veteran service space. So you mentioned trying to build up partnerships and relationships. Can you talk about that a little bit? And if so, is there any type of context or insight that you could provide in terms of how you're seeking to build out partnerships that would serve the whole individual, and whether or not that includes both inside and outside the veteran service space more broadly?
Absolutely. So that is actually probably one of the harder parts of my job here at Mission United, is building out that partnership and reaching organizations and businesses that offer services to veterans, but are kind of disconnected. And that was mentioned before, where there are so many different services and resources available when you go online and you select veteran services, right? And so we have a system that we use, a piece of technology that we use to refer people through that system for the different services that they need. But we also build that partnership personally. And so we like to go out to these organizations. We like to see the facilities. We like to see what they offer. Myself as a veteran had a little bit of experience of what it's like to transition. And so I know through personal experience what exactly I needed when I was transitioning. And so there are others who may need more than I did or less than I did, but just being able to have that personal experience and seeing that these organizations offer the things that I needed plus more is really helpful. And being able to build that personal partnership between the organization and myself outside of the technology that we use gives us the opportunity to be able to make those connections, call directly, send emails, so that whenever we do come across a veteran or an active duty service member, they can get exactly what they need without having to wait for somebody to receive a referral or for those services to become available. So we try and stay tapped in, and that's why that partnership is really important outside of the technology that we do use. Did that answer the question? I feel like I talked a lot.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's an interesting point in terms of looking to develop relationships in the real world, right? Like in how you can not only develop, but maintain those relationships. So, and that actually leads me to something that I want to pose to Christy. So in terms of that relationship building aspect, right? In terms of trying to help empower the community more broadly for the individuals that serve veterans and their family members. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experience with the community collaboratives that you run and some of that other work and how you look to build those relationships, both online and off.
Absolutely. So kind of, broadly, Serving Together really focuses on three major service lines. So that includes the coordinated care network that I mentioned earlier, that's really operated by our compassionate care navigators that work to connect the military and veteran families to resources. But there's two other areas that we really focus on. That includes our community collaboratives. So we operate about 10 different community collaboratives throughout the greater National Capital Region and now into Central Maryland, where we really bring partners together to network, share resources, and the goal being building capacity to better serve the military and veteran population. And then the other side of it is building cultural competency. So we do educational event series such as these regional community of practice events that you're part of today. We provide mental health first aid focused training that covers the military and veteran community, as well as other educational opportunities that are out there to help educate and train those who are serving this population on their unique needs, their talents, their experiences, how we can better serve them, whatever it is. We also actively participate in the governor's challenges in Maryland and Virginia. So that I know that those were mentioned in the last panel as well, and talk about priority areas such as suicide prevention efforts for our military connected community. So we put a lot of our time and energy into education. So when we think about veteran transition stress or more emergent needs like mental health or suicide prevention, the biggest thing that we think is we can't do it alone. We rely on our partners, the community members out there to see the warning signs and know how do we respond to someone that is in need of support. And so many individuals aren't aware, as we've talked about today, on the lifestyle or stressors that can be presented due to military services. So helping to educate our community really increases their ability and their capacity to serve those individuals. And ultimately, it increases our ability to help prevent more major crisis situations in our military and veteran community. So big focus, as mentioned, is for us to educate the community, build their cultural competency, and doing so through education and training events like this one today. And so obviously, thank you guys for joining.
Sure. Yeah, and before I move on, there's one component of this that I've seen over the years, and I've had the privilege to work alongside you, Christy, for a while now, but and it gets to something that Natasha was talking about, but relationships, right? And so this is something that I'm seeing, taking a little bit of a hit in COVID world, and everyone's trying to push through it with Zoom and whatnot. But as we're starting to, hopefully return to some form of normalcy, interested to hear, how the work that you do helps to facilitate relationships. Not only are you educating and empowering, but from what I've seen as well, and just asking you to speak, a little bit bragging on yourself, how some work like this can actually help empower and develop relationships between individuals and organizations that are doing this work. So.
Sure, that targeted towards me. So obviously, one of the big things that we found, as we were approaching COVID last year and all this news of us having to move to this virtual world, was that, we had the technology and capability to shift very quickly into a virtual setting. So we could offer these trainings and events virtually like that. We also offered all of our collaboratives virtually. And so we did see a huge spike and increase in our collaborative numbers, and even in these regional community of practice events, of people looking for ways to continue networking, continue outreaching, and continue to really collaborate together, even though they're all now working from home and not able to see each other in the in-person type setting. So we really work to continue to build those offerings and listen to the community, getting feedback from the community on what was needed, We tailored a lot of our collaborative meetings to bringing education and focus on the needs of the military and veteran space during the pandemic. So we talked about things like food assistance. We also really incorporated more topics into DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations in our meetings, and actually have now began incorporating DEI listening sessions into our works, that we can better understand how our military and our veterans are experiencing equity within the community, and or race and discrimination in their community. And so we really work to try and focus on what was really important this past year, bring that information to the organizations that are out there serving those community members, and that all have had to shift to virtually and figure out the better way to serve. And then obviously stay abreast of all that information and what's going on in the region, when many of our organizations had to shut down for periods of time. Many had to cut back the services that they could provide. And also it took them a little bit of time just to be able to figure out how to offer things virtually. And so our goal was really to try and stay as knowledgeable as we can of what's going on with each of the community members, as well as connecting the military and veterans, to those resources as seamlessly as possible.
Thanks, Christy. And Christy, something that you said, I think is a good segue to pose a question to Erin. So in terms of, trying to think from the veteran perspective, right, or from the client perspective, and how best to align resources and care in your communities to meet those needs. I know that's something that AmericaServes and Erin's team takes very seriously, a customer sort of centric focus. So Erin, I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about that in terms of how you bring the customer service perspective to your work in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, thanks, Vincent. Yes, like what you were saying is especially during COVID this year, we've trying to take a very veteran-centric approach to the veterans that we get to come to us. We want to make sure that we are gain creators in their lives, especially as it relates to mental health. We have a very short time with a lot of veterans that we work with, and we want every interaction that we have to be a positive incremental gain in their mental health. And oftentimes we do that through the connection of services. So we want to go above and beyond, exceed their expectations as often as possible. And sort of like, how do we do that? The Care Coordination Center, like I said, we use resources, but we are actively in the community helping problem solve. So we're in there, we're building relationships with organizations, we're actively problem solving with the community to help these veterans through resources to get them what they need. So what we've done there is that we would do it by accuracy. We want to get veterans to the right place the first time. That's bar none. The biggest way to build trust is getting them to the right place the first time. We do that through easier, less restrictive access to services. So the veteran only has to go to the places that he needs to go. He doesn't need to be redirected 3 or 4 times. We want to get him there. Make sure that make it seem as easy and less restrictive as possible for them. And then we also do it through co-occurrence. When we have that veteran, we're also always focusing on their short-term needs, but with the bigger picture of long-term goals as the outcomes we want to create. So we want to connect to resources that are helping them meet their needs today, but always have an idea, about and look into the future of what their goals are going to be. And that's through co-occurrence. So we're getting them connected to employment resources. We're doing prevention. We're preventing veterans from losing their homes and losing their utilities. But then we're also looking, all right, let's make sure that you don't have to come back here because you're getting those other resources that you need right now.
Thanks, Aaron. And I can pose this as a general question to anyone that wants to take it. Oh, wait, Dave, are you back online?
I am.
Oh, great. Okay, great. So we had lost you there for a minute. So just as a quick introduction, Dave Dos-Reis, Network Director for Rhode Island Serves. So Dave, I wanted to pose a question to all the different panelists and want to give you the opportunity to speak to this as well. Just in terms of how you see your role in supporting transition in the communities that you serve.
Sure. So in Rhode Island, one of the things is that we have smaller teams for just about everything, right? So regardless of the community partners that you're working with, or regardless of our office itself, we in our office have a 5-person team. Everything that we do has to be a full force multiplier. So when our military members are coming back to Rhode Island, whether they're coming off of active duty or whether they're coming back from National Guard and Reserve to the state, our transition is very much the responsibility of very small groups of individuals. And so the more tools that we can give them, the more support that we can give them, all the better. So from the state position, so the Office of Veteran Services, we look at it as our job that we connect every one of our veterans and all of our veteran families to all of these community resources. That being said, doing that is easier with a program like we have, because all of our communities or partners are tied in together through the same referral system. So our delivery is significantly easier and greater to be able to do that, so that folks don't have to travel all over the place to be able to do that. The other part is that transition for us begins when a service member is thinking about getting out of the military. So we offer those services to all of our service members and to their families when they're thinking about transitioning back to Rhode Island. So we're trying to take as proactive approach as humanly possible. And for us, that's what transition is. It's being proactive about what's the next phase of your life going to look like, and what do you think those needs are going to be, and how can we help you achieve those goals, meet those challenges. So.
And something that has come up as a theme here as we're talking in the previous sessions as well, we're talking about trying to break outside of the veteran service-based bubble, looking to build relationships, and trying to foster, trust and understanding amongst sort of community actors writ large who are serving the veteran population. And so, Dave, you as a state employee, frankly, and, operating out of the Office of Veteran Services for the state of Rhode Island, was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what it's like to operate sort of within government structures and how that can, be a benefit to the work that you do, and if there are any challenges as part of that as well.
Sure. So working for government, I've worked in the federal government at the VA hospital for, I think it was about 11 years over in Providence. And then now I work for the state going on 6 years, I want to say. And so there are positives and negatives to everything having to do with government, as I'm sure that everybody can assume. One of the positives that we have in the state is that when our community partners, our nonprofits, are coming together and they want to talk about services to wrap around for our veteran community, a lot of them, because they I don't want to say they're adversarial, they're going after the same prize, they're going after the same prize money, basically. They butt heads in that they're all looking for the delivery of the exact same services. But as the state, we see that the needs that our veterans have are very broad, and so they're not just one or two pools of money. So one of the things we do is we suggest out to them, hey, nobody is looking for grant money for funding for this. So like holiday services or for continued education services, for daycare services, things like that, things that veterans, just like anybody else, need, but aren't the first things that folks reach out for grant money. So things like housing, for example, those are the things that everyone wants to attack. Everyone wants to house veterans, and that's great. But one of the pots of money that folks don't necessarily think of is like substance abuse or substance use, mental health counseling in a broader sense. So in Rhode Island, one of the things that we've been able to do as well is we take our nonprofits and we help them double down on how best they can use those grant funding. So for example, if you're looking for services to be able to get folks to and from mental health crisis sort of centers, or you're looking for places for folks that are in crisis to be able to go who are having substance abuse related issues, we have state run programs and we have Medicaid programs through like both what's called Anchor. So they do things like sobriety. And then we have a thing called BH Link that deals with crises. They're almost like an emergency room for mental health services. And so getting them to write that into the grants helps them to be able to spread those dollars further, and it helps them to develop a plan that's going to capture them in the most professional setting to get them there. So even if they just have the ability to do transport, we can work with them to get a bolstered program so that they can transport more veterans, more family members more effectively to the programs that are best for them. One of the things I would say is a limitation working in the government, and again, if you've worked in government, you probably feel it, is that every couple of years there's transitions, right? So there's transitions of leadership at the most executive level. And so that trickles down. And so priorities change, focuses change, what ends up being necessarily popular in the media changes. And so you got to kind of roll with the punches a little bit for that, but you can also be proactive in your approaches. When new administrations are going to be coming in, be prepared for those kinds of things. Make sure that you have a brief, a subject matter brief on the top 3 to 5 things that affect your veteran community in your state, your community. And you make sure that those things are the things that slide across the desk first. So rather than beating around the bush and then having to reinvent the wheel, most incoming administrations are very appreciative of having that text already drawn up for them, to have that conversation already drafted, and then to find out what the best way that they can go and support that veteran community is. They're hearing the same things that you are when it comes to the media, when it comes to stuff that makes international attention. What they're not hearing is the specifics for veterans' needs and how they've evolved over time in your area. And you can be a really good conduit for making sure that they're informed for the current state of what veterans need in your community.
Great. And it's an interesting perspective, and sort of what I'm hearing, from Aaron, it was initially matching needs to resources in the community, right? And then looking at co-occurrence and sort of branching that out. But Dave, what I hear you saying as well in terms of the role that the state can play and does play is looking to match resources to needs in the service provider community, if you will. So, or where there's unmet need, or where there's potential for greater impact for service providers to make. So I want to pose this as a general question to the rest of the panelists. Do you guys see that as in your work, in the work that you do, ever opportunities that come across your desk where you're looking to match providers to opportunities that you're seeing in the community? Natasha, I see you nodding, so I'll call on you first.
So we do see a lot of time where many organizations offer the same types of services. And we're trying to get more organizations to, like David said, offer services or look for funding for more unique or different other than housing, food, and things like that. We have what's called our RFP process as a total united way where we request we take applications for requests for funding. And this year, we were able to do that for operational funding as opposed to programmatic. And so that allowed more organizations to request funding for whatever they needed as opposed to just doing a specific program. And so with that, more organizations surrounding veterans' needs were able to get funding to address other issues outside of housing, outside of hunger and things like that. And so in that way, where we're changing our request for applications for funding process, we're allowing more organizations to get that funding that may not be readily available or seem readily available through other grant processes. Our organization is making that a little bit more feasible, and we're trying to really target more organizations that serve the veteran and active duty community. And so through that RFP process, we're able to also get them funded as well.
Aaron or Christy, did you guys want to touch on that at all?
Yeah, I'll go. Yeah, we see that same thing too as well. I think one of the issues, not issues necessarily, but with a coordination center and this easy access to services is that we get veterans connected to these services a lot quicker and a lot more expedient. And that puts a burden on some of the smaller nonprofits, in terms of raising money to meet those needs. So we often get reached out to those organizations saying, you are our number one referral source. You send all these veterans to us. How can we work together to make sure that we can continue to meet the needs of the veterans that you're sending to us? So we play a role in that regard as well. A couple organizations have come to me and said, we've raised this money, we don't know how to spend it. You work with veterans, how should we be spending this money? What could we be using to do with this money? Those kind of things. So we do that pretty often. But like I said, one of the things too is that, especially during COVID, organizations had trouble raising money, and we're their number one referral agency, to getting veterans to them a lot quicker than they've ever would have in the past. So that's one of the drawbacks to getting, at least for a service provider. But the veterans are getting their needs met, which is a good thing.
Got it. Thanks, Aaron.
And I'll just add, from our perspective, within the National Capital Region, Serving Together gets sent, a lot of different opportunities for funding and grants, and we try our best to also then share those with the community as well. Our goal is also to really reduce duplication of services. That's part of our mission and part of our alignment with working with other organizations. I know we spoke about that during some of the panel discussions today as well. There's a lot of organizations that want to have a passion and serve the military and veteran community, but oftentimes it can increase duplication of effort. So we always look for ways to integrate services and programs. How can we work together collaboratively across the community to better serve and better build capacity for organizations to do and serve more? And so that's really kind of our goal, is sharing different opportunities that we come across, but also we're happy to partner and integrate programs and services with other organizations to really strengthen our region, strengthen the way that we're supporting the military and veteran community, so that we can do more and serve more.
Great.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to just say real quick too is that you've also got to be mindful in your community that popular things, or the greasy wheel, is what folks pay attention to. So we have a very large veteran population in our state, with the second most deployed National Guard and Reserve in the country. But a lot of our folks, they're not in crisis mode. So they don't necessarily need housing and food and services like that. Those things are covered down for us. We work with our colleges a lot. They have a program for veterans on campus to be able to help direct folks there. But with the veterans that are doing just fine in your community, you have to have programs that support their thriving, for them already achieving things that they want, to help them take next steps towards starting new businesses, bringing those things up to local government and saying, hey, we talk about building new businesses and folks starting entrepreneurial things. Make sure that you have that kind of a thing for a focus and attention too, because the dollars tend to miss the mark there. They are always focused towards crisis related services. And there's a lot of veterans that have come out and are doing well. They're invested in those programs and they want to achieve greater. So definitely shine a line on them in your community if you can.
Great. Okay. Well, I know that we are close to the top of the half hour here, so I want to be mindful of the time. I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you all so much for your thoughtful responses and the dialogue here. Hopefully the folks in the audience got a good flavor of the work it is that you do respectively in your communities and the roles that you play sort of more broadly. So Christy, I will hand it back over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Vincent. And thank you for the group that joined me today, Dave, Natasha, Aaron. Greatly appreciated your insight and what's going on in each of your communities. And I just also want to say thank you for our audience today. Thank you all for joining us. We do hope, as Vincent said, that the content was valuable for your time and allowed you to have further insight in some of the ways that we can support our veterans by better understanding the challenges they face as they transition, as well as the role our community can play to support them in a successful integration with their community. So we remind you, if you need any further assistance or resources, connections in each of your communities, please reach out to your AmericaServes Coordination Center. This obviously includes Serving Together here in the National Capital Region, the Central Maryland community, included our website, the Mission United team at South Hampton Roads, our PA Serves team in Greater Pittsburgh, our RI Serves team in Rhode Island, and as well as our New York City Vet Connect NYC in New York City. And before we wrap up for the today, we do need your feedback. So please open your mobile phone, select your camera, then hover over this QR code, and you'll see a little link pop up at the top of your phone that says, click here to go to the SurveyMonkey link. We ask that you complete that SurveyMonkey for this training and allow us to provide you more helpful topics like this that you would like to receive in future. So for those that do need CE credit hours, please complete this survey, and instructions will be provided at the end of the survey on how to receive a copy of your certificate for attending today's training. We do hope that you are staying safe and well, and we look forward to bringing you more training events like this soon. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.